Simulation Happy Hour acknowledges the land and the waters from which you are listening today. Welcome to Simulation Happy Hour. Sit back, relax, and let's talk about all things sim. Welcome to Simulation Happy Hour. I'm Mel Barlow.
I'm Jane Frost.
And I'm Jenny Bassett.
Welcome to today's session is the questions that came in to our resident mixologist, Maddie. And you can find her and you can see her on our website, or you can send her questions via our social media. And so a few questions came in this week. One from LinkedIn, which was a really interesting question, so much so we have an upcoming podcast dedicated to it around psychological safety. And are we being too safe now, particularly in undergraduate training? And is that in itself impeding learning? Are we doing our learners a disservice around not building resilience? So super interesting question. We could debate that all day long, which we will soon. But we're going to jump into a few questions today. The first one being, what is the big fuss with simulation? What is actually simulation? So I thought that was a good place to start on our first Maddie questions, who couldn't be with us today, but I caught up with her at happy hour last night, and she mixes a good cocktail, our Maddie. And so she gave me this question. So I thought I'd start with the SSH dictionary definition of sim, and then I'm going to throw it out to you guys to see if you agree or not. So there are two. So it says it's a technique that creates a situation or environment to allow persons to experience a representation of a real event for the purpose of practice, learning, evaluation, testing, or to gain understanding of systems or human actions. Or it's a pedagogy using one or more typologies to promote, improve, or validate a participant's progression from novice to expert. What's your definition? Do you agree with those?
Look, I'm going to go, I prefer the second one rather than the first. I think simulation is pretty broad, and that you'll often hear of simulations being run to see where the traffic will go around Sydney, for example. We're not talking about that kind of simulation. We're really looking at the simulation that prepares our student nurses or health professionals to be better prepared when they go into the workforce, I think. And I guess that brings us back to that psychological safety and how prepared we can actually make them. But giving them a safe space to make mistakes is what I really value about sim. Jenny, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I agree, Jane. I'm a huge believer in simulation can be anywhere. I think sometimes when we think about simulation, lots of people default to mannequins in labs, whereas for me, simulation can be in a classroom, it can be in a workshop. It doesn't have to be with a mannequin. So I think it's any opportunity for learners to practice, consider, give professional thought to situations that they may face in their clinical experience. So for me, it's a education, teaching, experience tool. I know sometimes we use simulation for assessment, and I think that's, again, back in that psychological safety space. So for me, it has a really broad meaning. Like lots of institutions haven't yet implemented virtual simulation. So, lots of opportunities there to still come. And the other thing, the HWA funding has left the simulation sector. So we got HWA funding in about 2010, 2012. But since that national funding is no longer available, I've seen huge changes in simulation and the roles that we all play in simulation. So, yeah, I think simulation can be very broad in its definition. And I think it comes with experience about how you apply that.
Jenny, do you think it's almost a way of thinking, or from what you were saying, I kind of thought that's what you were alluding to, that simulation is almost the mindset of how you're going into the classroom and doing things?
Yeah, as an educator, I think it's about thinking, which simulation do I use for what I want to teach today. Like we've spoken to Alistair, and if you haven't listened to Alistair's podcast, please go and listen to Alistair's podcast, because if you think about improv, well, then, it's absolutely completely limitless about what we do around simulation. So I think it comes down to the knowledge and experience of educators. And I think this could be quite controversial, but I think one of the other things is we are sometimes constrained by how we can replicate simulation across facilities inside of accredited courses. We need to replicate it to make sure that every student gets the same experience on every campus. But, I think provided the principles of the lesson are taught and the experience of the educator. So for me, Jane, I'd like to see it have a bit more freedom in the modality, to use one of the big words, the modality or the type of simulation that we can use. Because I can see areas where, when you're talking about a case study in a workshop, I'd love to give improv a go, but I've been doing simulation for a while, so maybe that's my own personal choice.
So, Mel, do you mind if I ask Jenny another question about that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
If you're saying that we can do things differently, how do we have that consistency? And I know that there are a lot of maybe less experienced educators than yourself, and casual staff that may not be as comfortable with using these techniques. So how do we make it scalable and unique and keep those learning objectives? I think that there's probably another podcast on that itself, in how to maintain that consistency. It concerns me that we won't get that if we do improv, for example.
So I think that's about investing in the staff that we employ, Jane, and I agree that there's a lot of casual staff that are doing simulations. Maybe that's in the tertiary sector, but I work in a GP practice, and as well as working in an institution. And so for me, the simulation, I've got a lot of, huge avenue around which simulation I choose to use for which situation. And so I agree with you. I think there does need to be a safety net about the scalability of simulation. But where you've got experienced clinicians, for me, I'm happy to share my experience. I'm happy to teach other clinicians. So it's about having time to do that, to have those discussions. But I think sometimes we're on such tight timelines. And the other thing is, it's cognitive load for educators. If I've got to come in and teach a session around vital signs and somebody's given me a script and this is how to do it, how much time have I had to prep as the casual academic to do that? And the same thing I think applies to in situ simulations, whether it's in a GP clinic or a hospital setting. How much time has the clinical educator got to prepare for that simulation? Because really, when you're doing it in situ, it's in that handover time, and it depends what's happened on the shift. So sometimes you've got to make an in the moment decision to change it, because the other thing is, sometimes the mannequin's voice doesn't work, or the battery's flat. So then what do? Then really you go to improv, which is not the exact thing around what Alistair was talking about, but I think it comes down to the experience of the simulation educator to be able to adapt that to still work in the time frame, or cancel it and reschedule it.
So before I jump to kind of my thoughts on the definition, I think I just want to touch on a point, like that scalability. And we're talking about improv, but improv is really a way of also enhancing our role play, which we do all the time. And role play isn't traditionally, by a lot of people, like in academics, seen as simulation for some reason. And these are conversations I have a lot. And I think we need to look at putting more structure around our role play. Like, how do we prepare our academics? How do we pre-brief? How do we debrief or give feedback? How do we build a background for that character? All those things. I think if there's structure in place, we can replicate it and scale it. So that's my thought. But in regards to the definitions, I think it's really about the environment you work in. So I looked at the first one, which is around representation of a real event for, not only learning, but for testing and understanding systems. So prior to higher education, I was in a hospital-based sim center. And so that definition was really relevant because we did a lot of usability process and system testing where we would replicate elements of a process or of a room and we'd test that. But now I'm in higher education. It's definitely more the second with the pedagogy. But I just want to call out that bit about representation of a real event. So when we look at that in itself, we do that in paper-based case studies. We do that in tabletop exercises. So is a case study sim?
Yeah, I think it is, Mel. I think that's students giving cognitive thinking to a situation that they may be exposed to in a healthcare setting. And so, Jane, what do you think? Because I think it is, but what do you think, Jane?
I think that it depends on the case study, because you can have a case study that says Mr. Smith attends the ED department with chest pain. That can be your case study, and I don't think that's simulation. If you augment that with all the details and really try and have a realistic representation of what that person is experiencing, then I think that becomes more of a simulation with all the background and the information around it. So I'm kind of on the fence really about case studies, because I have seen case studies really thin in the detail. Here you go off and it's much more about just the presentation rather than the person. And for it to be a realistic representation, my thoughts are it needs to have the person, it needs to have the information about what they're experiencing and then how you react to it, not just the physical signs.
Yeah.
And can I just add something there, Jane? I think that's a really valid point, because sometimes I think we forget that the students don't have the clinical context or the clinical experience that we have. So when you set a case study and you set it in ED, if a student has never been or a learner has never been to an ED department, that they have no clinical context. And so I think we forget how stressful that is for the learner. And I think I agree with you. I think it's very much in the design and how much information you give to the learner prior, and then what has been their experience in their learning journey. So, it's no use giving a really complex, in-depth disease, chronic care, disease patient to a first-year student. And I think that's the art and craft that experienced clinical educators bring to the space.
And yes, around that case study, like, how is it structured? Are we pre-briefing? Are we getting them together afterward and debriefing it? Or is it just go to your tables, work through the case study, and then off you go? So is there pedagogy around that? Yeah. Interesting.
Because the other thing the other thing I think that in there is that we ask the students to do the pre-learning. Well, in most teaching situations, there are some students who have done the pre-learning and there are some students who haven't. So then as an educator, I've got this other complexity to my setting in that I'm not just teaching simulation to, learners inside the box. You've got to teach across a breadth of students who did do the work and the students who didn't do the work. And I think that's another conundrum that educators face. Whereas if you're going to a simulation centre, most people have done the learning because they're paying money or they're excited and motivated to be attending there. They want to do well, so they may have done the pre-learning. So, I think there's a couple of other topics in there we can do a few more, quick chats around. So I may have made a complex situation of just a quick chat. But these things go around in my brain and I think, wow, this is a great opportunity to be able to discuss them.
And that's why we're doing this podcast, Jenny, so that you can get it out there.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
We're probably all thinking it. So another question came in, and I'm going to direct this towards Jane because I know you've got experience in this. Is virtual reality, VR simulation, and often they talk about in the same context this concept of micro simulations. So what is a micro simulation and is VR simulation?
So I think there are lots of products out there that are called VR simulation. And I think when you're in an immersive environment, it is simulating the real environment and can be very realistic. I'm not sure that we always apply the same principles. So I think sometimes we forget to do the pre-brief I guess more importantly, we forget to do the debrief because they come out of the experience and they're all high on the experience and, that was really cool. But we actually don't have the same structure as we might do if we were doing it in a simulated ward environment where we debrief the situation. So I think there are a lot of things that are now called simulation that we just have to be aware that you still need to close the loop in the learning cycle really by coming back and doing that debriefing at the end to see what people got out of it. Because I think, as we're going to talk about in another podcast, the psychological safety is an issue when you're putting people into very realistic situations, and VR can really make that immersion. But there's also mixed reality, which can help. And I think that can augment simulation and actually show you signs and symptoms and actually display a patient so that you're seeing a patient. The term microsim is something that's come out recently, and it's more about those short bites of almost interactive, like training that you can do on a computer. Whether we think of that as simulation, I think it is a simulation, but again, we're just often putting those into an LMS, learning management system, just for anybody who's not from a university. And we just leave it for the students to have a look at and go, tell us what you thought of that, rather than actually wrapping around and embedding it or using it in a classroom or a workshop where you can actually debate or talk about and debrief the concepts that came out of that. So I think it can be considered, but I think it's a bit like case study. It depends on the content and it depends on that wraparound would be. Yeah. But those are only my thoughts.
Yeah.
I totally disagree.
So,
I
Jane,
think they are. Oh, yeah.
So, and I really enjoyed, your line around VR. What role then do you think reflective practice plays? Because we talk about the debrief, but sometimes I wonder, what happens around reflective practice? Whether that's because to me, debrief can sometimes be guided reflective practice. But do you think our learners go away and go, oh, that happened and this happened, and then they go and look it up, or do you think they just dump it and move on to the next experience?
Well, I guess it's what the simulation is. So there are some very, maybe not traumatic, but realistic simulations that put you in the position of being the patient and things. For example, there's a cultural one where you're in an overseas hospital and you are the patient, but you can't understand what's going on. And after that, you probably do need the debrief. I mean, you can write a reflection, sure, but there's safety around that. So I'm conscious that we might be going into that psychological safety that we're going to talk about another day. But I think you do need to protect the students because you don't know what their background is. You don't know what they've experienced before and what's actually going to trigger them in a virtual environment. So I think there needs to be that safety net. And I think you could use guided reflection. You could actually have them watch it and then do that. But I guess you're still not going to get that interactive debrief of actually being able to talk through what's just happened and how that might work in practice, which I think is what we actually want to close the loop on is, yes, we can show you this, but in reality, what's going to happen? And in reality, what would you do differently? Those kind of things to give them the chance to go, oh no, I went into VR and I killed the patient. Okay, that's quite traumatic. Afterwards, you go, okay, so what have you learned from that? Well, I've learned that I'm never going to do this again. Okay, so you can close that loop and reassure them that actually what you've done is learn in a safe environment rather than leaving them with the fact that, oh my goodness, they killed the patient.
And I think in an upcoming episode, that's a super important point. And it also brings up debrief versus feedback. And when do you use either of those? And so I know upcoming we've got Kate Morse and Mary Fay, and that's going to be a topic of discussion. Like in sim, when is feedback okay? Action-based feedback, which is more in VR, and when you get scores or you go to the next level in gamification, that's a form of feedback. And when do you need a debrief, a facilitated reflective discussion? So yeah, that's a session in itself too. These are good questions. And our last question for today's session was around that there are, it's really around, should we be following in Australia the American-based ENACS standards? So I have a strong opinion about that.
I was going to say, you answer that
one. Yeah, I think we'll let you answer that one. Okay.
Well, I guess fundamentally, yes. I mean, these standards exist. They're good. They're evidence-based. I think we need them to guide practice. There are also standards out of ASPE, the UK-based society. They're great. We need, guidelines to guide our practice so we can be consistent and safe. They are good standards, but they are North American-centric. And some of the terminology and translations don't really translate to the Australian or New Zealand context, really. We have different socio-cultural, socio-historical, I guess, impacts. And so in recognition of that, like Kerry, who couldn't be here today, but she and I and a number of others across Australia and New Zealand recognize this. And so we've actually done some work to contextualize these international standards to the Australian and New Zealand context. Initially, to say, well, how can we do that and focus on simulation design? Because we kind of thought when we went through all the standards, if you get the design right, it kind of has input and cross-contamination, if you like, across all the standards in the design. You've got to think about the pre-brief, you've got to think about the debrief, you've got to think about evaluation, who's facilitating, what is their capacity and capabilities, and all those things. So we've created a framework called the Quality Simulation Assurance Framework. So we call it QSAFE. And we've had end user input into that. And so that we're about to publish. But in recognition of that, we've it doesn't quite tick the box of ensuring culturally safe simulation relevant to our context. So that's our next phase of research, is we're getting broader perspectives and First Nations input across Australia and New Zealand to say, how do we create culturally safe simulation relevant for our context? So yes, I agree, standards exist. We should be using them all. We actually did a scoping review to see how these standards have been implemented, not just referenced, but how they've been explained, they've been applied. And they were
in Australia or in America, Mel?
Globally, but virtually no one is referencing these in the Australian and New Zealand based research and literature. So I think raising awareness that these standards exist to support educators, but in acknowledgement that they might find it overwhelming at first because there are many standards that all intertwine. And so hopefully our work can help simplify that for people.
That sounds like really amazing work, Mel. So I hope you'll give us a link when you do publish so that we can put it on the site. I think from my perspective, in the absence of other things, then I think that they're a good start, the ones that are published, the INACSL standards. And until we have your fantastic work, I do think that they're a reference point, but I don't think enough people know about them.
Agree.
Yeah, and I agree totally with what you've both said. And I think sometimes trying, when you go to your manager and say, I need this personnel to be able to do this, we have nothing to base that in. There's nothing in any accredited or registration within Australia or New Zealand that says, you need this personnel to be able to do this simulation. And I think that's creating some stress points for educators in trying to implement quality simulation. So I'm looking forward to hearing. Are we doing a podcast about the QSAFE, Mel and Kerry?
We can. And I think it all stemmed from, it really stemmed from when you look, I'm going to use the ANMAC standards because we're nurses. So they're the accrediting standard for nurses and midwives. It recommends quality simulation. It recommends the integration of First Nations perspectives. When you ask frontline educators and academics, what does that mean? How do you do it? That's the point that's lacking. That's the gap. And so that was our sole purpose, really, initially, of creating QSAFE, was around, well, this could be what quality simulation looks like. And this could help considerations of First Nations perspectives and doing it safely, because ultimately people are too scared to go there because they don't want to offend. They come from a really good place. But we need to go there. We need to have these conversations to improve healthcare. So, yeah.
Looking forward to that one.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Maddie, our mixologist, for gathering those questions for us. And we'll see you next time. So thanks. Bye. See you next happy hour.